My name is Layla Porter. I'm in my 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words that sound like compliments, but land like instructions. Reliable, practical, low maintenance. The one who doesn't make things awkward. I work a steady job. I pay my bills on time. I'm the person who remembers birthdays without needing a Facebook reminder and who reads contracts before signing them. And because I'm calm, because I don't slam doors or turn every disagreement into a scene, people sometimes mistake that calm for softness, or worse, for permission. If you met me at a dinner table, you might think I'm quiet. You'd see me listening more than talking, offering to help clear plates, asking the question no one else thought to ask. I've learned how to take up very little space, not because I don't have a voice, but because I grew up in a family where peace was treated like a currency, and I was expected to be the one who kept paying. This story is about the moment I realized something that, in hindsight, had been building for years. It's about a house I paid for out of my own pocket, a home I built so my parents could retire with comfort, stability, and dignity. A house I thought I was building for us, in the way families say us when they mean love, loyalty, and shared future. But what I didn't understand, at least not fully, was that in some families, generosity can quietly be reclassified as obligation. That support can become entitlement, and that a daughter who provides can still be treated like she's only there on sufferance. The title of this episode says it plainly. The day I realized I was treated as nothing more than a lodger in the house I paid for, out of my own pocket to build for my parents' retirement. And that's the truth of it. I built the house with my own money, yet I was made to feel like I was merely staying there on sufferance. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no screaming match, no dramatic meltdown, no gotcha moment designed to humiliate anyone. It's a story about quiet clarity, about the small cuts that don't bleed but still leave scars, about the slow, humiliating shift from family to function, and about what happens when a woman stops explaining her worth and starts honoring it. So let me ask you gently, before we begin, have you ever done something deeply loving for someone, and then realized they'd started treating it like you owed it to them? In my family, I was the dependable one. Not the dramatic one, not the fragile one, not the one who needed rescuing. I was the one who handled things. If the internet bill was confusing, I translated it. If the doctor's office needed follow-up paperwork, I filled it out. If my parents worried about their retirement savings, I ran spreadsheets and reassured them in numbers. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being their daughter and became their solution. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. When I was younger, being the capable one felt like praise. I wore it like a badge. Teachers admired my independence. Relatives told me I was so mature. My parents leaned on me in ways that felt flattering at first. I liked being trusted. I liked being useful. Usefulness is addictive when you grow up in a household where love is often expressed through sacrifice. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had built a solid career in project management. I was organized, meticulous, strategic. I saved aggressively. While my friends were upgrading cars and booking impulsive vacations, I was building something invisible, security. My parents had always dreamed of retiring somewhere quiet, somewhere stable, somewhere that wasn't rented month to month. They had worked hard their entire lives, but not in ways that built wealth. There were medical bills, there were financial setbacks. There were decisions made from emotion rather than strategy. And I saw the future clearly. If I didn't step in, they would age into instability. So I did what I had always done. I stepped in. The idea started as a conversation over tea at their kitchen table. "We don't want to be a burden," my mother said. And I remember answering immediately, "You're not." But even as I said it, I had already begun calculating. Land prices, construction estimates, mortgage structures, tax implications, ownership frameworks. Within a year, I had purchased a modest plot of land in my name. I financed the build with my savings and a carefully structured loan I could comfortably manage alone. Every contract, every payment, every signature had my name on it. It wasn't a grand mansion. It was thoughtful, functional, single level, accessible for aging knees and backs. Wide doorways, good natural light. A small garden my father could tend. I told myself I was building them peace. When the house was finished, we moved in together. The plan was simple. They would live there permanently. I would have my own suite. We would share space but maintain independence. It felt modern, cooperative, sensible. Friends called me incredible. "You're such a good daughter. You're giving them their dream." And for a while, I believe that's what it was. But something subtle shifted once the boxes were unpacked and routine settled. The house stopped being the house Layla built. It became our house. Then slowly, it became their house. I noticed it in small language changes. Your father doesn't like the couch in the living room. Can you not leave your laptop on the dining table? We don't usually eat that late here. The word here began to carry weight. Here, as if I had arrived from somewhere else. Here, as if I were a guest adjusting to house rules. At first, I brushed it off. Families renegotiate space. That's normal, I told myself. But I also noticed something else. When relatives visited, my parents gave tours. They talked about the layout, the garden, the neighborhood. They never mentioned who paid for it. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't malicious. It was omission. And omission, when repeated enough, rewrites reality. To them, I wasn't the architect of their comfort. I was the quiet, practical daughter who happened to be living there. Useful, reliable, peripheral. I didn't resent them, not yet. But somewhere deep in my chest, something tightened. I had built a foundation of brick and concrete. But in their eyes, I was still temporary. The first real cut didn't come in the form of an argument. It came disguised as a joke. It was a Sunday afternoon. My aunt and uncle were visiting for the first time since we'd moved in. My mother had prepared too much food, as she always did when she wanted to impress someone. My father was giving a tour of the garden, explaining the irrigation system like he'd installed it himself. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, refilling plates, wiping counters, keeping everything flowing smoothly. That was my role. Seamless background management. At some point, everyone gathered in the living room. My aunt looked around, nodding approvingly. "It's such a beautiful home," she said. "You're lucky your parents were able to secure something like this before retiring." There was a small pause, just a small one. I waited, not for praise, not for applause, just for accuracy, for one sentence, one small clarification. Layla made this possible. Instead, my father chuckled modestly. "We were fortunate, things worked out." Things worked out. I felt something in my chest drop, just slightly, like missing a step in the dark. I told myself it didn't matter. It was social smoothing. No one likes talking about money in front of extended family. Maybe he didn't want to embarrass me. Maybe he didn't want to look dependent. But then my aunt turned to me, smiling. "So how's it feel living back at home?" Back at home. I laughed automatically, a soft, polite laugh. "Oh, it's good," I said. "We're making it work." Making it work, as if I had moved into their space, as if I were adjusting to their generosity. And here's the part that surprised me most. No one in the room saw anything wrong. No one noticed the inversion. I had funded the land. I had signed the mortgage. I had wired the payments. I had chosen the contractors. And yet, in that moment, I was framed as the adult child who had conveniently moved back in with her parents. I watched my mother nod along gently, not maliciously, not dismissively, just comfortably. The narrative suited her. It protected her pride. It preserved their authority. It cost me something invisible. After everyone left, I stood in the kitchen alone, rinsing plates under warm water. I replayed the conversation in my mind. I wasn't angry. That's what made it confusing. I was displaced, like a painting slightly crooked on a wall, not shattered, not broken, just off. And here's the detail that lingered. It wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't say. No correction, no acknowledgement, no quiet. Actually, Layla made this happen. That night, lying in my room, the suite I had designed in the house I had paid for, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I had never considered before. If something belongs to you, but no one recognizes it as yours, does it still feel like ownership? That was the first small cut. No blood, no scene, just the faint realization that the story being told about this house did not include me in the way it should have. And the most unsettling part? I said nothing, because peace, in our family, had always been more important than precision. And I had always been the one willing to pay for peace. After that afternoon, nothing dramatic changed, which is exactly how it works. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in like furniture, subtle, functional, gradually unquestioned. The language shifts continued. "If you're going to be home late, just let us know. We usually lock the doors by 10. We prefer shoes off in this house." In this house, each sentence was small, reasonable even. If you isolated any one of them, it sounded like normal cohabitation etiquette. But context matters. I wasn't a 22-year-old moving back after college. I was a woman in her 30s who had financed the land, signed the contracts, and assumed the debt. Still, I adjusted. I texted if I'd be home late. I removed my shoes without comment. I rearranged my schedule around their rhythms. I told myself I was being respectful. That shared living required compromise. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I began editing myself. If I wanted to repaint a wall, I hesitated. If I considered replacing a piece of furniture, I asked. If I invited friends over, I kept it small and quiet. Somewhere inside me, ownership had turned into permission-seeking. The second cut came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just finished a long day at work. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the dining table had been moved slightly. On top of it sat a stack of mail, opened. My mail, utility statements, insurance documents, a bank envelope I hadn't had time to review yet. I picked up the stack carefully. "Did you need something from these?" I asked gently. My mother didn't look up from the stove. "We just thought we'd sort the household bills, since we're all living here." "All are living here." I swallowed. "I usually handle those," I said. "It's easier if I keep them organized." My father waved a hand dismissively. "No need to carry everything yourself. This is our home too. Our home." There it was again. That collective ownership, spoken as if contribution were irrelevant. I didn't correct him. I didn't say, "Legally, it's mine." I didn't remind them that the mortgage draft came exclusively from my account. Because technically, they were right. It was their home too. I had built it for them. But something about the opened envelopes unsettled me more than I expected. Not because of privacy alone, but because it signaled an assumption, an unspoken belief that my financial decisions were communal property, that my income, my obligations, my structure were simply extensions of the household. Later that week, I overheard my mother on the phone. "Yes, Layla's staying with us for now," she said casually. "Staying, for now." I stood frozen in the hallway. Staying implies temporary. Temporary implies non-essential. Non-essential implies replaceable. And that's when I realized something difficult. The narrative had solidified. In their version of reality, I was the responsible daughter who happened to reside in the family home. Helpful, financially stable, convenient, but not central, not foundational. I began rationalizing it. They're older. They need to feel in control. They sacrificed for me when I was young. I reminded myself of their long work hours, their struggles, and their love expressed through effort rather than language. Gratitude became my silencer. Every time something felt off, I answered it with loyalty. Every time a boundary blurred, I told myself it was kindness. And slowly, almost invisibly, I accepted a role I had never consciously agreed to. Provider, manager, stability anchor, but not the owner, not authority, not equal. That's how normalization works. It's not one big betrayal. It's a series of small adjustments you make to avoid discomfort, until one day you wake up and realize you've adjusted yourself out of your own space. And the most unsettling part? No one was being cruel. They were simply comfortable in a story where my contributions were assumed, but not acknowledged. And I kept telling myself it didn't matter, until it did. There's a moment in every slow realization where you stop asking, "Why are they doing this?" and start asking, "What role have I been quietly performing?" That shift didn't come from a fight. It came from observation. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. My parents were in the living room with a neighbor couple I hadn't met yet. I could hear laughter, easy, relaxed. I paused in the hallway before stepping in. "And Layla's very independent," my mother was saying. "She likes doing her own thing. We just let her handle her work and stay out of her way." Stay out of her way. It sounded generous, progressive even. But as I listened, I realized what was missing. There was no mention of shared ownership, no mention of financial structure, no acknowledgement of partnership. In their version of the story, I was the self-sufficient adult daughter who happened to occupy a room in their retirement home. Helpful, quiet, low maintenance, contained. When I walked into the room, they smiled warmly. Introductions were made. I sat down, polite as always. The neighbor woman tilted her head. "It must be nice for your parents to have you nearby." I smiled. "It's nice for all of us," which was true, but also incomplete. That night, after everyone left, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't correct the narrative. I did something quieter. I began paying attention. I noticed who decided when guests came over, who chose decor updates, who rearranged shared spaces without discussion. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't strategic. It was simply assumed authority, and assumed authority only thrives when no one challenges it. The truth was uncomfortable. I had never asserted ownership, not emotionally. Legally, yes. On paper, absolutely. But emotionally, I had behaved like a considerate, long-term guest. I asked before changing anything. I deferred in shared decisions. I minimized my preferences to avoid friction. I had confused peace with erasure. And families, especially loving ones, often adapt to the version of you that's most convenient. They weren't assigning me the role maliciously. They were responding to the signals I sent. I was the calm one, the flexible one, the one who doesn't mind, so they built their expectations around that. Reliable, useful, invisible. It hit me fully one morning over something small. I had ordered a new reading chair for the corner of the living room, a space I rarely used because it always felt claimed. When it arrived, my father looked at it thoughtfully. "Where were you thinking of putting this?" he asked. "In the living room corner," I said lightly. He hesitated. "We've kind of kept that space open." Kept open, as if the living room were a museum exhibit curated before my arrival. I nodded slowly. "It's just a chair." He shrugged. "We just like things the way they are." We, that word again. I realized something in that moment. I was being permitted to occupy my suite, my room, my designated space. But the rest of the house, the spaces I financed, designed, and envisioned, had become theirs symbolically. I had built a home. They had claimed a territory, and I had accepted a room. That's when the role crystallized in my mind. I wasn't the owner. I wasn't even the equal cohabitant. I was the adult daughter who should be grateful to be included. And the unsettling part? No one ever said it directly. They didn't have to. The hierarchy was silent, and I had been upholding it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because once you see the role you've been cast in, you have to decide whether to keep performing it. The shift didn't come from the chair. It didn't come from the open mail or the polite omissions. It came on an ordinary weekday morning, so quiet that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. I had taken the day off work to meet with a contractor. Nothing major, just routine maintenance on the exterior drainage system. The kind of thing homeowners schedule without thinking. The contractor arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. I walked him around the perimeter of the house, explaining the layout, the build timeline, and the materials used. He asked questions about the foundation, about long-term soil movement, and I answered them all, because I knew. I had been there from blueprint to final inspection. I had chosen the grading plan. I had approved the materials. I had read every line of the warranty. At one point, he paused and said casually, "You must have been proud when this place was finished. It's solid work." It was the first time in months that someone had spoken to me as the primary decision-maker of this house, not as a daughter, not as a cohabitant, not as someone staying, as the builder. I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not pride exactly. Recognition. After he left, I stood in the driveway for a long moment. The morning light was soft, touching the windows in that gentle way it does when a house still feels new. And I asked myself a simple question. Why do strangers understand my role more clearly than my own family does? The answer wasn't about them. It was about me. I had minimized my position to protect their comfort. I had softened language, deferred authority, and avoided corrections because I didn't want to embarrass them or disrupt the image of independence they wanted to maintain. But in doing so, I had slowly stepped out of alignment with myself. That afternoon, my mother mentioned wanting to host a small gathering the following weekend. She was already discussing menu plans, seating arrangements, and who would be invited. Normally, I would have nodded and adjusted my schedule. Instead, I heard myself say calmly, "Let's look at the calendar together before we confirm. I have plans that evening." It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't sharp. But it was different. She blinked, slightly surprised. "Oh, I didn't realize." "I know," I said gently. "We should coordinate." "We should coordinate." Don't ask. Not informed. Coordinate. The word landed quietly between us. She agreed without argument. But I saw something subtle in her expression, a recalibration, and I realized something important in that moment. Authority doesn't always require volume. It requires clarity. That was the day something shifted. Not in the house, not in my parents, but inside me. I stopped interpreting their behavior as deliberate disrespect, and I started recognizing my own participation in the imbalance. I had treated my ownership like an inconvenient detail, something to hide to preserve harmony. But harmony built on distortion isn't peace. It's a postponement. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened the original purchase documents. The deed, the mortgage agreement, the insurance policy. My name stood alone on every line. For the first time in months, I read them not defensively, but calmly. Not as ammunition, as alignment. I didn't feel anger. I felt steadiness. The shift wasn't about confronting them. It was no longer shrinking. And once that internal line was drawn, quietly, privately, everything that followed would move differently. Because silence, I was beginning to understand, could either be submission or strategy. After that morning in the driveway, I didn't announce anything. I didn't sit my parents down. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I didn't rewrite the family narrative overnight. I simply stopped shrinking. And the interesting thing about not shrinking is that people notice, even if they can't name what's changed. My silence shifted first. Before, my silence had been appeasement. It was the quiet of someone smoothing edges, swallowing corrections, choosing comfort over clarity. Now it has become observational, intentional. When my mother referred to the house as ours in front of a neighbor, I didn't correct her, but I didn't smile in agreement either. I let the statement sit in the air without reinforcement. When my father casually mentioned adjusting something structural in the garage, I responded evenly, "Let's review that together before making changes. I'll want to approve any modifications." Approve, a word I had never used before. He looked at me, just briefly, not offended, just recalibrating. That was the pattern. No explosions, no accusations, just language tightening into accuracy. The more precise I became, the more subtle the tension in the house shifted. Not hostile, just aware. They began asking slightly more questions before making decisions about shared spaces. "Would you mind if we move this? Are you okay with changing that?" The first time my mother asked for my input before inviting extended relatives to stay the weekend, I noticed something else too. She wasn't just asking for scheduling. She was asking for permission. And for a moment, I saw the imbalance from the outside. They had been operating under assumed authority, but assumed authority only functions when the true authority stays quiet. My earlier silence had supported the illusion. Now my quiet carried weight. They mistook it at first. I could see it in the way my father occasionally tested the boundary. Small comments. "You're very particular lately. You've become quite structured." He meant it lightly, but underneath was a question. "Why are you different?" I didn't answer defensively. "I've always been structured," I said calmly. "I'm just being clearer." Clearer, not stricter, not colder, clearer. And here's what surprised me most. The more composed I was, the less they pushed. There's something unsettling about calm authority. It doesn't give anyone something to argue against. If I had yelled, they could have labeled me emotional. If I had accused, they could have defended themselves. If I had cried, they could have comforted and deflected. But steadiness offers no entry point. Silence, chosen deliberately, became strategy. I stopped over-explaining my financial decisions. I stopped volunteering updates about my income. I stopped absorbing logistical tasks that weren't mine. If something wasn't my responsibility, I didn't automatically fix it. And that created subtle friction. Not anger, adjustment. They had grown used to a daughter who absorbed everything quietly. A daughter whose competence made their lives smoother without drawing attention to the source of that smoothness. When that automatic smoothing paused, the household rhythm changed. Bills that used to be handled invisibly required conversation. Repairs required formal approval. Invitations required coordination. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. And here's the part that mattered most. I wasn't doing this to punish them. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I was withdrawing the assumption. There's a difference. Affection remained. I still cooked dinner sometimes. I still sat with them in the evenings. I still asked about their day. But I no longer blurred the lines of ownership to preserve their comfort. Silence had become a choice. And when silence is chosen, not imposed, it carries gravity. They began mistaking my calm for stubbornness. But it wasn't stubbornness. It was alignment. For the first time since the house was built, I felt like I was standing fully inside it. Not in my suite, not in a designated corner, but in the structure itself. And they could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand what it meant. The interesting thing about reclaiming clarity is that it doesn't always look like action from the outside. From my parents' perspective, I had simply become a bit more particular, slightly more structured, slightly more involved. What they never noticed was preparation. I didn't rush into anything dramatic. I didn't threaten to sell the house or move out. I didn't create ultimatums. Instead, I did what I've always done best. I gathered information, quietly. First, I scheduled a meeting with a property attorney, not because I was planning a confrontation, but because I wanted to understand my position without emotion clouding it. I brought every document, the deed, the mortgage agreement, insurance policies, tax filings. We sat in a clean, neutral office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The attorney reviewed everything with clinical efficiency. "Legally," she said, tapping the deed, "this property is entirely yours. There's no shared ownership, no implied tenancy, unless you've signed something granting it." I nodded. I hadn't. "And if you ever needed to change the living arrangement," she continued, "you have full authority. Of course, we'd recommend careful communication given family dynamics." Careful communication. I almost smiled. Family dynamics had been the invisible clause in every decision I'd made for years. Next, I met with my financial advisor. I wanted a contingency plan. If I moved out, could I rent the property? If I chose to refinance, what would that look like? If I decided to sell, what were the tax implications? I didn't share these meetings with anyone at home, not because I was hiding, But clarity doesn't require an announcement. At night, I reviewed numbers. Market value had increased since the build. The neighborhood was developing faster than predicted. The asset I had constructed out of loyalty had quietly become leverage, and leverage changes. Posture. I also began documenting subtle patterns, not to build a case against them, but to check my own perception. When were decisions made without me? When was I consulted? When was language inclusive versus presumptive? What I discovered was uncomfortable. It wasn't constant exclusion. It was situational. In private, they deferred more often now. In front of others, the old narrative resurfaced. With relatives, I was still staying. With neighbors, they were still the primary homeowners. Image mattered to them, pride mattered, and I understood that. I truly did. But understanding no longer meant surrendering structure. There was another layer to my preparation, one they would never see. I began reimagining my life independently, not out of anger, out of the possibility. What would my evenings feel like in a space entirely curated by me? What would it feel like to make decisions without calculating emotional fallout? What would it be like to host guests without checking a family calendar? I wasn't fantasizing about escape. I was recalibrating autonomy. The more I prepared, the calmer I became, because preparation eliminates panic. And here's the truth that settled over me like a quiet certainty. I didn't need recognition to validate what I had done. The paperwork validated it. The numbers validated it. The structure validated it. Their acknowledgement would have been meaningful, but it was no longer necessary. One evening, my father mentioned wanting to renovate part of the backyard. "It'll increase the property value," he said casually. I looked at him steadily. "If we're making structural changes, I'll coordinate with the contractor directly." He nodded. No argument. And I realized something subtle but powerful. The authority had shifted, not because I demanded it, because I embodied it. They still didn't know about the attorney. They didn't know about the contingency plans. They didn't know that I had calculated every exit and every alternative. They believed I was simply being more involved, more attentive, more present. They never noticed that I had stopped reacting and started positioning. Preparation is invisible, and invisible power is the most underestimated kind. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning freedom. And once you begin preparing for freedom, even if you never use it, you move differently. They sensed it, but they couldn't quite name it. The private reveal didn't come from the attorney. It didn't come from the spreadsheets or the property valuations. It came one evening when I logged into my mortgage portal and saw something I hadn't paid attention to in months. The principal balance had dropped below a threshold I had quietly set in my mind years ago. A milestone. Not public, not ceremonial, just a number that represented something undeniable. Control. For so long, I had framed the house emotionally as an act of love, of duty, of loyalty. But sitting there in the glow of my laptop screen, I saw it for what it also was. An asset, fully structured in my name, increasing in value, approaching a point where I could refinance on significantly better terms, or eliminate the loan entirely within a short window if I chose to accelerate payments. The leverage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measurable, and in that moment, something inside me went completely still. Not triumphant, not vengeful. Clear. I realized I had been emotionally negotiating in a space where I held structural authority the entire time. I had been shrinking in a house that legally, financially, and strategically belonged to me. The realization wasn't empowering in a dramatic way. It was grounding. I opened a second tab and reviewed rental market data for the area. Comparable homes were leasing at rates that would more than cover the remaining mortgage and generate income. I wasn't planning anything drastic, but for the first time, I understood this wasn't a moral dilemma. It was a choice, and choices feel different when you truly have them. That week, another small incident unfolded, small enough that a previous version of me would have brushed it aside. A distant cousin was visiting. During dinner, he joked, "Layla must love having free rent while working full-time." There was laughter around the table. I didn't laugh, not out of offense, out of clarity. My mother gave a polite smile. My father didn't correct him. The old pattern hung in the air, but this time I didn't feel the sting, because I knew something they didn't. After dinner, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The house lights glowed behind me, warm and steady, and I understood something that shifted the entire emotional dynamic. Their narrative only had power over me when I needed their validation. The moment I stopped needing them to acknowledge my contribution, the imbalance dissolved internally. I no longer felt like a lodger emotionally, even if they still framed me that way socially, because I knew the truth in concrete terms. Ownership isn't about who tells the story. It's about who holds the deed. That night, I reviewed one more set of documents: insurance beneficiary designations, estate planning outlines, and refinancing projections. I wasn't just protecting myself financially. I was deciding what version of the future I wanted to fund. Did I want to continue underwriting a living arrangement that required me to shrink? Or did I want to redesign the arrangement entirely, without hostility, without drama, but with unmistakable boundaries? The private reveal wasn't that I had power, it was that I had options, and options are the quietest form of dominance. I didn't feel anger toward my parents. I felt compassion. They had slipped into a narrative that protected their pride. They likely didn't even see it as a distortion. But compassion no longer meant compliance. In the past, I would have confronted them emotionally, seeking understanding, seeking acknowledgement. Now, I didn't need a conversation to move forward. I needed a decision. And decisions, I've learned, are most powerful when made privately first. The next phase wouldn't be about proving anything. It would be about choosing. And once a choice becomes clear inside you, the external world eventually has to adjust. They still believed I was simply living there. They didn't realize I was evaluating whether they were. Once I understood I had options, the house felt different. Not colder, not hostile, just negotiable. For weeks, I carried the decision quietly inside me. I ran scenarios in my mind the way I run project forecasts at work. Option 1, continue exactly as we were. Accept the imbalance, preserve comfort. Let time smooth things out. Option 2, confront them directly, clarify ownership publicly, reframe the narrative in front of relatives and neighbors. Option 3, redesign the structure without spectacle. The first option felt familiar but heavy. It required ongoing emotional cost, quiet resentment, constant self-editing. The second option promised immediate clarity, but at a price. Pride would be wounded, defensiveness would rise, conversations would spiral into history, sacrifice, and gratitude. It would become about who owed whom. I didn't want a moral battlefield. I wanted alignment. That left the third option, restructure, not as punishment, as design. One evening, I invited my parents to sit with me at the dining table. No raised voices, no tension, just tea. I've been reviewing my long-term financial plans, I began calmly, and I need to make some structural decisions about the property. They exchanged a quick glance. What kind of decisions? My father asked. I'm considering transitioning the house into a formal rental structure within the next year. Silence, not explosive, just stunned. A rental? My mother repeated softly. Yes, I said. That doesn't mean anything changes immediately, but legally and financially, I need the arrangement to reflect reality. I didn't accuse them of anything. I didn't mention the jokes, the omissions, the language. I kept it structural. This property is a significant asset, and I need it to operate as one. My father leaned back, processing. So what does that mean for us, he asked. It was the first time the hierarchy had reversed in a sentence. For us, it means we discuss a formal lease, I said evenly. At a rate that's fair and sustainable. It protects all of us. Clear expectations, clear boundaries. My mother looked hurt, not angry, but unsettled. Are you unhappy here, she asked. I held her gaze gently. I'm not unhappy, but I need clarity, and clarity requires structure. There it was. No drama, no emotional explosion. Just a line drawn in calm ink. The decision wasn't about money. It was about recognition. If I were treated socially like someone staying in their home, then the arrangement needed to be legally consistent or consciously corrected. I wasn't going to argue for acknowledgement anymore. I was going to redesign the system. They didn't argue that night. They didn't agree either. They asked for time, and I gave it because the decision had already been made inside me. Whether they chose to sign a lease or choose another living arrangement, the structure would change, irreversibly. That's what made it powerful. Not anger, not revenge, irreversibility. For the first time since the house was built, the dynamic was no longer based on unspoken assumptions. It was based on documented reality, and documentation doesn't argue. It simply stands. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in months, not because the situation was resolved, but because I had stopped negotiating with myself. The next phase would unfold slowly, but it would unfold on my terms. After that conversation, the house became very quiet. Not tense, measured. My parents didn't bring it up immediately. They moved through their routines as usual. Morning tea, evening news, and gardening in the late afternoon. But something subtle had shifted in the air. They were thinking, and so was I. I didn't push for an answer. I didn't remind them daily about leases or timelines. Pressure would have turned this into a power struggle. Instead, I moved forward administratively. I contacted the property attorney again and asked her to draft a standard residential lease. Nothing aggressive, nothing inflated. Fair market rate adjusted slightly below average. Long-term stability, clear maintenance responsibilities. Professional, clean, impersonal. Then I met with my financial advisor and began preliminary refinancing discussions. If the property transitioned into income-generating status, the terms would shift favorably. The numbers made sense. Again, I told no one, not because I was hiding, because strategy doesn't need an audience. At home, I remained calm, present, respectful. I still shared meals, still listened to my mother's stories, still helped my father research gardening equipment, but I stopped absorbing ambiguity. When a repair came up, I handled it formally, documented invoices, tracked expenses, and discussed cost allocation in neutral language. When my mother mentioned inviting relatives for an extended stay, I responded gently, "Once the structure is finalized, we can clarify guest terms." Guest terms. The phrase landed softly, but it carried weight. A week later, my father approached me in the kitchen. "We've been talking," he said carefully, "about what you said." I nodded. "It feels transactional," he admitted. "I understand," I replied. "But it's already transactional. I've been carrying the financial side alone. Formalizing it just makes it transparent." He didn't argue with the logic. Logic is hard to argue with when it's calm. My mother was quieter, more reflective. I could see pride wrestling with practicality. She had never wanted to feel dependent, and I had never wanted to make her feel that way. But dependency doesn't disappear just because it's unnamed. Silence doesn't erase structure. 2 weeks passed. During that time, I also met with a property management consultant, not to outsource anything yet, but to understand rental logistics thoroughly. If my parents chose not to sign a lease, I would list the house. The market was strong, demand was steady. I had already reviewed alternative housing options for them, senior-friendly communities nearby, smaller rentals within their budget if combined with pension income. I wasn't planning to displace them abruptly. I was preparing for every outcome. That preparation gave me something unexpected: peace, because once you are ready for any result, fear loses its grip. At dinner one evening, my mother finally spoke. "If we agree to this lease," she asked quietly, "does that change how you see us?" The question wasn't about money. It was about a relationship. I paused before answering. "It doesn't change how I see you," I said. "It changes how we define this house." She absorbed that slowly. The house, not the family. I wasn't severing bonds. I was clarifying ownership. And clarity, even when uncomfortable, is cleaner than pretense. A few days later, my father asked to review the draft lease. No raised voices, no accusations, just paperwork on the dining table. The same table where, months ago, I had quietly rinsed dishes after being framed as someone living back at home. Now the narrative had shifted, not loudly, but undeniably. They were beginning to understand something fundamental. I wasn't a lodger, and I wasn't asking to be treated like one anymore. I was restructuring reality to match the truth that had always existed. And I was doing it without anger, without spectacle, just steady movement. That's the power of moving in silence. By the time people realize what has changed, the change is already complete. The consequences didn't arrive as arguments. They arrived as atmosphere. Once the lease draft was printed and placed on the dining table, something intangible shifted in the house. Not hostility, just awareness. The kind of awareness that settles in when a truth can no longer be avoided. My parents read every page carefully. I made tea and gave them space. From the living room, I could hear the soft turning of paper. My father cleared his throat. My mother asking quiet, clarifying questions about terms, maintenance responsibilities, notice periods, utilities. They weren't angry. They were adjusting to a new reality, and that adjustment had weight. Over the next week, small consequences began surfacing, not because I enforced anything harshly, but because structure naturally changes behavior. My father stopped casually referring to renovations without consulting me first. My mother began checking the calendar before inviting guests, even hypothetically. Conversations included phrases like, "as the owner," without irony. The narrative was correcting itself, but correction has an emotional cost. One evening, I overheard my mother speaking softly to a friend on the phone. "She just wants things to be clear," she said. "It's her investment, after all." Her investment. The words weren't bitter. They were resigned. And I realized something important. Clarity had replaced assumption. Assumption is comfortable. Clarity is sobering. A few days later, my father approached me while I was reviewing documents at the kitchen counter. "We never meant to make you feel like a guest," he said quietly. I looked at him, steady. "I know," I replied. And I did know. That's what made this different from a typical conflict. There was no villain here, just unexamined dynamics. He hesitated before continuing. It's difficult to think of ourselves as tenants." There it was. Pride. Identity. I nodded slowly. "I understand, but I can't continue thinking of myself as a lodger either." The word hung gently between us. Lodger. I hadn't said it out loud before. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue, because somewhere he knew the inversion had existed. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were relational. Dinner conversations became slightly more formal at first, not cold, just careful. They were recalibrating how to speak about the house, how to refer to it in public, how to describe our living arrangement to others. The shift extended outward too. When a neighbor asked my mother about hosting an upcoming gathering, she replied, "We'll need to check with Layla since it's her property." Her property. The correction was subtle, but unmistakable. I felt no triumph, only steadiness, because the goal had never been to humiliate. It had been to realign. Still, consequences ripple. The more transparent the structure became, the more they had to confront something uncomfortable. They were living in a house funded entirely by their daughter. That truth, once formalized, carries a psychological weight that informal generosity can obscure. They began speaking more carefully around extended family. No more jokes about me staying, no more casual omissions. The story was rewriting itself, not because I demanded applause, because paperwork leaves little room for fiction. And fiction had been the only thing propping up the imbalance. The house felt different now, not heavier, clearer. The air was less ambiguous, and sometimes clarity feels like distance before it feels like peace. But distance isn't always damaging. Sometimes it's simply space, rearranged honestly. They were beginning to feel the loss of the old narrative, the version where pride remained untouched and structure remained unspoken. And once that narrative is gone, it cannot be restored. There's a quiet kind of panic that doesn't look like panic at all. It doesn't shout, it doesn't slam doors, it moves through silence. About 3 weeks after the lease draft was introduced, my parents asked to sit down again. This time, the tea between us went untouched. My mother spoke first. "Is this because we didn't acknowledge what you did?" she asked gently. It was the closest anyone had come to naming it. I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't soften it immediately either. "It's because I need to live in my own house as myself," I said calmly. "Not as someone who's staying." The word lingered. She looked down at her hands. "We never thought of you that way," she said. And I believed her. That's what made this complicated. Intent and impact rarely align perfectly. My father leaned forward. "If we made a mistake, we can correct it. We can tell people. We can be clearer." I studied his face carefully. He meant it, but something inside me had already crossed a threshold. This wasn't about public acknowledgement anymore. It was about structure. "It's not about announcements," I said quietly. "It's about how we operate." They had grown comfortable in a version of the house where emotional hierarchy overrode financial reality. Correcting the narrative socially would not undo the pattern, because patterns once established don't disappear with apology. They asked for time again, but this time, there was urgency under the surface. I could feel it in the way my mother began researching rental laws quietly. In the meantime, my father reviewed his pension statements more closely. They were calculating now. For the first time, they were evaluating their position, not emotionally, but practically. And here's the truth that settled over all of us. The old arrangement could not be restored, even if I withdrew the lease draft. Even if I said, "Forget it." They had now seen the structural reality. I was the sole owner, they were not. That awareness doesn't disappear once introduced. It lingers. A few days later, my mother knocked gently on my door. "Would you ever consider transferring partial ownership to us?" she asked softly. It wasn't entitlement. It was hope. Hope that equality could be retroactively created. I didn't answer immediately, because I had already done the math. Transferring ownership would complicate financing, reduce flexibility, and eliminate the very clarity I had just fought to establish. It would also reward the imbalance that had existed. "I'm not comfortable changing the ownership structure," I said evenly. "It was built this way intentionally." Her eyes watered slightly, not dramatically. Just the quiet sting of pride confronting limitation. "We didn't realize it mattered so much to you," she whispered. That was the sentence that told me everything. It mattered to me because it defined my position. And for years, my position had been quietly minimized. Now that the structure was visible, they wanted to fix it emotionally. But emotional repair doesn't undo legal architecture. The moment I introduced the lease, the dynamic became transparent. Transparency can't be reversed. They could adapt. They could negotiate. They could choose to move elsewhere. But the illusion was gone. And once illusion is gone, comfort changes shape. There were no tears that night, no raised voices, just the heavy realization that the version of me they had grown used to, the endlessly accommodating daughter who blurred her own boundaries, was no longer available. Too late to fix with a simple apology. Too late to pretend it had always been balanced. We were standing in the truth now, and truth doesn't bend back into convenience. The final conversation happened on a quiet Sunday morning. No tension in the air, no audience. Just the three of us at the dining table, the same table where months earlier I had silently washed dishes after being mistaken for someone living back at home. My father had the lease document in front of him, neatly aligned with the edge of the table. "We've reviewed everything," he said calmly. I nodded, waiting. My mother looked at me directly this time. "If we sign this," she asked, "will you still feel like our daughter?" It wasn't manipulation. It was vulnerability, and I answered her honestly. "I've always been your daughter," I said, "but I can't stop being myself to preserve that." Silence followed, not strained, just reflective. My father exhaled slowly. "We got comfortable," he admitted. "We didn't mean to erase what you did. But I can see now, we let the story drift." Drift. That was accurate. No villain, no scheme, just drift. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every small cut. That would have turned clarity into accusation. Instead, I said something simpler. When I built this house, I did it out of love. But love doesn't cancel structure, and structure doesn't cancel love. They absorbed that. For the first time, there was no defensiveness in their posture, only acceptance. My mother reached for the pen. Her hand hesitated briefly, not because she disagreed, but because signing meant acknowledging something irreversible. She signed first, then my father. No dramatic sighs, no emotional speech. Just sign the meeting paper. The sound was quiet, final. Afterward, we sat there for a moment. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed. The house didn't feel colder. It felt defined. My father folded his copy carefully. "We'll make this work," he said, not as resistance, as commitment. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about dominance. It was about alignment. The confrontation had no heat because I had removed ego from it long before it happened. There was no need to win, only to be accurate. I stood up and began clearing the teacups. "You should have told us sooner if you felt small," she said. I looked at her gently. I didn't realize I had made myself small. That was the truth. They hadn't forced me into invisibility. I had participated in it. The difference now was that I no longer would. As I walked through the living room afterward, the space felt different. Not because ownership had changed, but because acknowledgement had caught up to reality. No applause, no reconciliation scene, just clarity. And clarity, when achieved without cruelty, doesn't fracture relationships. It recalibrates them. We weren't returning to what we were. We were becoming something more honest. And honesty, even when quiet, carries weight. It's been over a year since we signed that lease. On paper, very little looks dramatic. My parents still live here. I still live here. We share meals. We talk about ordinary things. Weather, health appointments, and television shows we pretend not to be invested in. From the outside, nothing about this house would suggest that a turning point ever happened. But internally, everything is different. I no longer move through these rooms as someone negotiating her right to exist. I move as the owner, not loudly, not arrogantly, simply, fully. There's a difference between occupying space and inhabiting it. Before I occupied. Now I inhabit. When I rearranged the living room 6 months ago, I didn't ask permission. I informed them respectfully. We discussed it. I listened to their preferences, but I didn't shrink my own. When I travel for work, I don't feel like I'm leaving their house. I feel like I'm leaving my property in capable hands under clear terms. Language has changed too. When relatives visit, my parents introduce the home differently now. "Layla built this place," my father says matter-of-factly. "She structured everything," my mother adds. There's no discomfort in their tone anymore, just acknowledgement. And here's the part that matters most. I don't need those sentences the way I once would have. They're not validation, they're accuracy. My identity no longer depends on whether the story is told correctly in a room full of people, because I know it deeply. This experience didn't make me colder. It made it clearer. I still believe in generosity. I still believe in supporting family. I would build the house again if I had to, but I would build it with a structure from the beginning. I would never confuse silence with kindness again. I've learned that quiet women are often mistaken for endlessly flexible ones. That calm can be interpreted as compliance. That loyalty, when unguarded, can slowly become an obligation in someone else's mind. But I've also learned something more powerful. You don't have to raise your voice to redraw a boundary. You don't have to humiliate anyone to restore balance. You don't even have to narrate your strength. You just have to stand inside it. Today, when I walk through the front door, I don't feel like a lodger. I don't feel like a guest. I don't feel like someone who must justify her presence. I feel like a woman who built something solid, physically and internally, and chose not to abandon herself inside it. The house hasn't changed, but I have. And sometimes that's the only renovation that truly matters. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Love without structure slowly distorts. Not because people are cruel, not because they're calculating, but because comfort fills in the blanks left by silence. I built a house out of devotion, brick by brick, payment by payment, decision by decision. But somewhere along the way, I allowed devotion to blur definition. I allowed gratitude to override clarity. I allowed myself to become smaller than the foundation I had laid. And the most surprising truth? No one forced that on me. They adapted to the version of me I presented. When I presented myself as endlessly accommodating, they accepted it. When I presented myself as the structured owner, they adapted again. That's the quiet power most people underestimate. You don't need to explode to change a dynamic. You don't need to embarrass anyone to reclaim space. You don't need revenge to restore dignity. You need alignment. Alignment between what you've built and how you allow yourself to stand within it. I didn't win anything. There was no dramatic moment where everyone applauded my strength. There was just a shift, from invisible contributor to acknowledged architect. And that shift didn't begin with paperwork. It began the day I stopped negotiating with myself. If you've ever funded something, emotionally, financially, spiritually, and felt quietly erased inside it, I hope this story reminds you of something gentle but firm. You are allowed to structure what you sustain. You are allowed to correct a narrative without humiliating anyone. And you are allowed to inhabit the very space you built. So I want to leave you with one question. Have you ever mistaken silence for peace when what you really needed was clarity? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the strongest form of dominance isn't loud. It's quiet, and it's chosen.